Good evening, everyone. Welcome and thank you for being with us. It's going to continue to let people in as we get started. Again, my name is Randy Zucker. I'm the Arts and Culture Director at the JCC. A little wave to Karen Sanders, our Arts and Culture Manager, my partner in everything. So we hope that everyone is well, and we thank you for joining us this evening. And just as we're waiting for everyone to log on, I want to let you know that this program is going to be recorded, and I'll be keeping everyone on mute to avoid ambient noise, but we encourage and would love for you to submit any questions in the chat box throughout the conversation, and we'll review and them at the end of the program. In addition, please forgive in advance if there's any technical issues that we might encounter during tonight's Zoom. Hopefully not. Look for a follow-up email with any information on purchasing Rich Cohen's book and viewing the recording of tonight's program. We are so fortunate to live in a culturally rich area with people who come from a diverse background and generously want to share their knowledge with us. Tonight's program is so unique in that we tapped our own community and found such a person. And I'd like to introduce to you Mitch Slater, who will be moderating our program tonight. After a very successful 35-year career as a financial advisor, the last 12 at UBS, Mitch has pivoted to become a manager, director of digital communications for national sales. In this new role, Mitch is hosting programs for advisors on UBS TV, as well as creating content for both advisors and clients. Before Mitch joined UBS, he was a financial advisor at Smith Barney and Merrill Lynch for 23 years. He worked closely with clients to build balanced and diversified investment portfolios that match the needs and risks of his clients. A longtime Westfield resident, where he served 2 terms on its Board of Education, Mitch has always been a staunch believer in financial literacy and education, and has often been tapped to discuss family financial issues on CNN, CNBC, Fox Business, Bloomberg, News 12 New Jersey, and several radio programs. He was proud to start his career working for Larry King, who you will hear more about later. Most recently, Mitch has hosted his own UBS Advisor podcast, Financially Speaking with Mitch Slater, which recently aired its 100th episode. Guests include Rock and Roll Hall of Fame musicians to entertainers, as well as serial entrepreneurs. And we are thrilled to introduce Mitch Slater. Hi, Mitch.
Hi, Randy. Thank you so much. I am so happy to be here. Before we start, I have to give out a hi, Mom, because my 95-and-a-half-year-old mom figured out the link I sent her on her iPhone and hit it and is watching tonight. So way to go, Mom. Don't tell me people in their 90s can't do tech. Before we begin, I'd like to take a few moments, though, to share with our audience a little bit about Rich's background. And I could go on forever here, but I'm going to keep it to the Reader's Digest version. And fortunately, most of you tonight know what that expression means, because I know when I use that expression around my kids, I don't have a clue. Rich is the author of several New York Times best-selling books, such as Tough Jews, Monsters, Sweet and Low. You'll hear more about that later. When I Stop Talking, You'll Know I'm Dead, which he wrote with Jerry Weintraub. The Sun and the Moon and the Rolling Stones, a great book for a Rolling Stone fan like me. And the Chicago Cubs, Story of a Curse. He is co-creator of an HBO series, Vinyl, which I absolutely loved. And just for the record, it should have been on still be on, as a matter of fact. And a contributing editor at Vanity Fair and Rolling Stone. He's written for The New Yorker, The Atlantic, Harper's Magazine, among other publications. He won the Great Lakes Book Award, the Chicago Public Library's 21st Century Award, and the ASCAP Deems Taylor Award for outstanding coverage of music. His stories have been included in the Best American Essays and the Best American Travel Writing. And he's joining us this evening from Connecticut. And there is a lot that we can talk about with our shared love of music and baseball. But for now, join me in welcoming Rich Cohen. Hey, Rich.
Hey, how are you?
I'm great. I'm great. Thanks so much for being here. I want to show everybody your book. I got a little glare going on here because I wanted to get Ebbets Field in the background, and you'll understand the Brooklyn connection in a minute. But Rich, thanks so much for being here. And I was thinking about how to start this interview, and you made it really easy for me on page 9 of your book. So I'm going to ask you to read a little bit of that section, because I think that kind of sets the stage for where we're going to go tonight.
Okay. This is about my father and his home neighborhood, Bensonhurst. To Herbie, Bensonhurst was home and Manhattan was the city. Distant, romantic, unattainable. Talking about a neighborhood character who never got out, one of my father's old friends will say, he hasn't even been to the city in 40 years. Herbie sometimes describes the Bensonhurst of his youth as a shtetl on Gravesend Bay. Asked to account for the large Italian population, he adds, it was Calabria too. Here's how he breaks down the overall demographics. 48% Jewish, 50% Italian, 2% other. Herbie's childhood apartment was ideally situated, a block and a half from the center of the known world, the busy intersection where the fathers ascended the stairs of the elevated in the morning and descended them in the evening, where candy shops, cigar stores, and newsstands crowded into an urban quintessence, and the street lamps burned all night. A Brooklyn kid in that era was less affiliated with a family or a school than with a corner, a headquarters, where he could bullshit for hours. Herbie and his friends were based out of 85th and Bay Parkway, the way the 101st Airborne is based out of Fort Campbell, Kentucky. It's where they planned and prepared and where they always returned. They were at home at 85th Street and Bay Parkway, the way Thomas Jefferson was at home in Monticello. Hugh Hefner was at home in the Playboy Mansion. John Gotti was at home at the Ravenite Social Club on Mulberry Street in Little Italy. It's where they tested the identities they'd assume in the world. It's where they became themselves.
I love that line. It's where they became themselves, because that I think just says everything. And let me tell you, those group of Brooklyn kids really did become themselves as they really learned everything on those streets. And from a young age, they became part of a social athletic club, but that kind of was like a gang as well, right? The Warriors. So this was not like the Jets and the Sharks kind of gang, right?
No, these were just a bunch of Jewish kids from the neighborhood who basically had a club that mostly was involved in playing sports. And they had jackets, and they were called the Warriors because their club room, which was in one of their friends' basement, was near a Pontiac dealer. And the logo for the Pontiac dealer was this Native American head. And they were able to steal stuff from the nearby Pontiac dealer to decorate their clubhouse and thereby have professional grade insignia.
Well, they started young, and they were doing all kinds of things. And one of those gang members, as mentioned earlier, happened to have been my first boss. But back then he was known as Zeke or Larry Zeiger. Before we'll talk a little bit later about Larry King and the whole connection, but the nicknames, I'm so fascinated by all the nicknames that all of these guys had. Was there one person that came up with the nickname for the other, or that just sort of fell into place?
Well, it's funny because I was talking just to my wife yesterday about how a lot of kids I grew up with got a nickname in junior high school, and it was bad.
Yeah.
The nickname was bad. And your ideal was to get through junior high school, which I did, without getting a nickname. You could breathe a sigh of relief. But their nicknames were affectionate and funny and good. And it was kind of like, a lot of them, they're like, my father's parents were immigrants. They were from Poland, basically. English was their second language. They spoke Yiddish in their house, and they spoke with thick accents. And their nickname was sort of like the name they gave themselves or were given out in the world. And they were mostly funny. So the guy who had the clubhouse where they had the Warriors headquartered, his nickname was Hoo Ha. And the reason he got that nickname was when he was a kid, he wasn't that bright all the time. And somebody asked a question, he said, who? And they repeated the question and he said, huh? So he was Hoo Ha. And Larry Zeiger, it was Zeke the Creek, the mouthpiece, because he like never shut up and he talked all the time. And even as a kid, he said he planned to be a radio announcer and he used to stand on the corner and announce what was happening on the corner. And my father's nickname, according to him, and I always found it hard to believe, was Hansomo. And when I asked him why it was Hansomo, he said, because I was so good looking. So he's not that good looking. So I once remember asked my grandmother if, you know, his friends really called him Hansomo. And she said, well, I know that's what he asked everyone to call him. So the jury's out on that one.
Well, I mean, if you're going to choose a nickname, Hansomo, why not? I mean, you might as well pick a good one. But boy, is that true about getting through junior high school without a nickname. I barely survived it myself. So I totally understand where you're coming from. But one nickname is a personal favorite of mine. And it really became a personal favorite when I worked for Larry King, and Larry would tell all of the stories of growing up in Bensonhurst. And this particular story is known as the Mappo story. And if I was back in 1982, I'd be putting a little cart in a machine, and 13 minutes later, Larry would wake up from a little nap or after having his ninth pack of cigarettes and his 400th cup of coffee and get back on the air. But for now, maybe you could give us kind of a version of that story, because if you weren't there, you would say it's not true, but it's true.
Well, how about the Reader's Digest version, since you brought it up?
Sounds great.
Okay, so when they were in ninth grade, my father, Larry, and this guy, Brazzi Abadi, I think I got his name right. I've heard this story so many times, originally from my father and from Larry, both. I heard Larry on the radio. And the story was that they went to pick up their friend, Gil Mermelstein, to walk to school for the first day of ninth grade, which at that time was the last year of junior high school. And they got to his house, and they all called him Mappo because of his hair. He had like a head of the hair like a mop. And the house was all closed and it was dark, and there was a cousin waiting outside, and they asked, where's Mappo? And they said, Mappo has tuberculosis and he's gone to Arizona for the treatment, and I'm just closing up the house. And then I'm supposed to go to the school and get his records transferred so he can go to school out there. And my father, being very nice, said, you don't have to go to the school. We'll tell the school. You can just do this. He goes, oh, that'd be great. That'd save me a trip. Thank you. And then as they walked, my dad said to Larry, hey, Larry, I got a great way to make $20, which you could spend at Coney Island. He said, what? He said, we go to school and we tell him Mappo died. And then we raise money for a wreath for his funeral, which is a crazy thing. But somehow he convinces these guys that they should do this. There's a lot of origin stories of how this happens. But ultimately, they go to the front office to say Mappo died. According to my father, the school then called Mappo's house. The number was disconnected. They figured that meant it was true, and they wrote on his card, deceased. Then my dad, Larry, and Brazzi go from classroom to classroom, raising money for a funeral wreath. They then take that money and spend it all at Coney Island, and then quickly forget about the whole thing. And then, like several months later, they get a call to go to the principal's office, and they're freaking out because they think that they got found out and they're in big trouble. My father's like, calm down, let's see what they say. And the principal says that every year the high schools get all this attention for sports, but the junior high schools don't get any attention. So they're going to start giving an award to an act of community service by a student or group of students. And it's going to be called the Gil Mermelstein Memorial Award. That's Mappo. And the first one is going to be given to my father, Brazzi, and Larry for their raising money for a funeral wreath for Mappo. And Larry and Brazzi are freaking out that they're going to have a big assembly. Their families are going to be there. They're definitely going to get caught out. My father's like, just calm down. This is good. We're getting honored. We're going to get an award. And by the time Mappo comes back, we'll be out of this school. We're going to be in high school outside the jurisdiction of the principal here. He can't do anything to us. So they go to this huge assembly at the end of the year. It's a giant assembly with like 500 kids in the school auditorium. And there's a big banner over the stage where they're sitting that says first annual Gil Mermelstein Memorial Award. And according to the way Larry would tell it, Gil Mermelstein, in the most remarkable recovery in the history of tubercular medicine, returns to school that day. And he goes into the school and the school's empty. And he's very confused. So he goes to the office and he asks where everybody is, and they say they're all in an assembly. And he goes in. Now he has a choice. There's a side doors. He can sort of sneak into the assembly or go outside of the street and come in through the big main doors, which are huge brass doors, make a ton of noise. And Mappo chooses to go in that way. He opens these doors, they clang, he's late. Everybody turns around in the back. The kids, they know it's Mappo, and they instantly know what my father, Larry, and Brazzi have done. And it's the greatest joke of all time. And they start to laugh. Okay. And the laughter spreads from the back all the way up to the front of the auditorium. Meanwhile, Mappo is frozen, because my father would say Mappo is not that smart, but he knows what memorial means. And it means you're dead. And you don't want your name next to it. And he's like frozen. And the laughter gets all the way to the stage. The principal doesn't even know who this kid is. He puts on his glasses. He's confused. My father and Larry and Brazzi see Mappo. And my father jumps up and yells, "Go home, Mappo. You're dead. You're dead." And Mappo turns and runs. And the story is that then they go to the principal's office and they're in big, big trouble. And the principal sits him down. He's yelling at him. He's threatening him. He's going to kick him out. They're never going to graduate. They're never going to go to high school. They're never going to go to careers. Their lives are ruined. And Larry's crying hysterically. Brazzi's crying. And my father says, "Hold on, principal. You're making a big mistake for you." And this was the beginning, according to Larry, the beginning of my father's career as a negotiator, because he said, "Forget us. We deserve whatever you can do to us. But what's going to happen to you? Look at it from your side. You hear from 3 kids who've never done anything good anyway, and they tell you a kid's dead, and all you do is call the house and you don't get an answer, you write deceased, and then you give them an award. Yeah, we're not going to school again. You're never working as a principal again." So this decision is made just to forget the whole thing. And the story is when they go to graduation, they're graduating. My dad, because it's by height, my father walks behind Mappo in the line. And when they go to give the diploma to Mappo, my father pushes him aside and says, "I'll take that. Mappo's dead." So that's a story that I grew up with.
And you just, my God, one of the funniest stories. And I would advise anybody, you can go to YouTube, type in Larry King Mappo story, and you can actually hear Larry deliver the story as well. And to me, it's been one of the funniest. I mean, you've lived it and you heard it as a kid, but since I was 22 years old when I first heard it, I haven't stopped laughing. And it's interesting that you mentioned sports, because sports was a big deal for a lot of kids growing up. And I have Ebbets Field behind me for all the Brooklyn Dodger fans out there. But speaking of Brooklyn Dodgers, one of the kids that your dad grew up with and Larry grew up with was a really good basketball player, but he decided to play baseball. Tell us a little bit about that kid.
Well, that would be Sandy Koufax, who was a couple of years younger than him, but who they played basketball with at the JCH in Bensonhurst. So they all played basketball at the JCH and they were all friends. And Sandy Koufax didn't really play baseball. I mean, other than sandlot playground, he was a great basketball player, and he was on the JCH. These are stories I've heard from my father. The JCH had an all-star team, which was, the best players from all these different teams in the league. And the all-star team was very good. And the New York Knicks came, this is, in the late 50s. So it's not the New York Knicks like today, but it's the New York Knicks. The New York Knicks came to play.
They were probably better.
Yeah. The New York Knicks came to play at the JCH against the all-star team. And Koufax was playing center, which tells you, because he's like 6'2", it's not a very big center. But the story is that he totally dominated the Knicks center and dunked on him several times, and actually I believe it was written about, and I've seen those articles. And my father claims that Koufax, whose career was shortened by having arm trouble, that his arm wasn't hurt playing baseball, that his arm was hurt. He saw his arm hurt playing basketball on one of the outside courts, like in Coney Island or Bensonhurst, where he made a layup and then was driven into the post behind the basket, which my father would call Brooklyn rules, which is you can make the layup, but you're going to pay a price for it. And that was a price he was still paying, when he was throwing no hitters for the Dodgers. And the story about how he started playing baseball, I don't know if you know this, I don't think I have it in the book, but he went to University of Cincinnati, I guess it was, where Oscar Robertson played basketball. Great basketball team, like best basketball team in the country. He was recruited, he was on scholarship, and he was like a freshman, and he saw tryouts for the baseball team, and he saw that the baseball team would be going late in the late winter to train in Florida. So he tried out because it would be a free trip to Florida. That's the only reason he tried out. And then they got him throwing the ball, and they realized, oh my gosh, this kid is throwing the ball like 100 miles an hour. And that's the beginning of Sandy Koufax's baseball career.
And what's still to this day, one of the greatest World Series pitchers of all time. And I remember Larry telling me about your dad and Larry at the Dodger games, giving Koufax, they wanted to give him matzo sandwiches. And if I recall, Koufax would be like, get away from me, get away from me. And the other players, Jackie Robinson or whoever, they loved the sandwiches. There's some truth to that?
Yeah, it's a story I always heard, that he was, embarrassed because he was playing at the beginning of his career at Ebbets Field, which was, a very easy trip for them. And they would go to those games and they would get into those games for free, one way or the other. And they would hang over the dugout and try to hand him these sandwiches. And the story was that Koufax, I think, if I remember, had to be on the roster because he was the bonus baby. He got paid money, which meant extra money, which meant you had to be on the roster. It was a way to discourage that. So he wasn't very good then. He was at the beginning of his career. He was wild. But he was embarrassed by his friends, as we all have been. And the other players just recognized delicious free food and took it.
Exactly. So let's get back to Herbie Cohen. So your dad graduates right before Gil Mermelstein, and he goes into the Army, and he played some basketball in the Army himself, right?
Yeah, my father's like, not a great athlete, I would say, but a really good basketball player because he played a very smart basketball game, and he always had a lot of strategy. In the same way that his negotiating came out, was very similar to the way he played basketball, and he became a basketball coach. And I believe in a different era, he might have stayed as a basketball coach. So he had this ability in all sports. I felt his genius was to figure out how a mediocre team can actually beat a good team. And it was all about controlling pace and doing what's unexpected. And this ability caused him in the Army, where he was stationed, right on the east-west border, driving what is essentially a tank in a very dangerous place, to get the attention of the people that ran the regiment basketball team, and eventually made him the coach. And he was coaching guys who later play in the NBA and Division I college basketball, and he won the European championship. These are other stories that I heard when I was a kid, and I kind of half believed him. And then I found this old scrapbook that somebody had cut out with all articles from Stars and Stripes. And it was like the whole season of that was chronicled. So to me, this came down to having to play him in basketball in our driveway, where usually he was wearing, loafers and a suit and beating the crap out of me. And that's the reason why I never played basketball. If you're his kid, he was like a bit like the great Santini on the basketball court. He would trash talk you, try to make you lose your cool, and maybe even cry a little bit. So that's why in my family, my brother and I played ice hockey, because he knew nothing about ice hockey.
Smart move. So, Herbie always seemed to get himself into wherever he needed to go. I mean, what is it about the mannerisms that made him, this, I think you call it, I'd call it chutzpah. I guess it's a student of authority that really, led him to this incredible life and the book and everything else that, he did with negotiating.
Well, he believed that most people will do whatever they're told, and that if you act like you know what you're doing and know where you're going, people tend to believe you. So, and I saw him do this again and again and again, sometimes just for fun, So I think he's really a student of human nature. And he had a real distrust of authority that probably came out of the experience of what Jewish people went through in World War II. And the saying that he always quoted for me is, don't put your trust in princes. And, that was just like, he was constantly testing that. And that was everything from how you play basketball to how he deals with people in his life and business too. He worked for the Carter and Reagan and Clinton administrations and hostage negotiation with the Russians. And it was all the same thing. It was basically, he believed in this thing, win-win negotiation. And I believe he's the one, he didn't make up that phrase, but he repurposed it. Because when I was a kid, he was working for the University of Michigan, teaching business and negotiation. They were working on game theory, and that was the thing from game theory, which is the different scenarios when they did the odds. And one was win, lose, 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 win, win, win. And he believed that win-win was basically the only kind of negotiation that would last, because both sides had to feel like they came away making the other side hurt a little bit and getting a little bit of what they wanted. And I saw him, when I went back and reread his book, which was a huge hit when I was a kid, called You Can Negotiate Anything. I saw that the book was, I just remember it as a kid, and I remember like little tricks he taught. It's an incredibly humane book. And it's about sort of dignity, and treating people like people and not humiliating people. So I think when he looks at a negotiation, he looks at people that are very harsh and try to crush the other side. To him, that's the Soviet style. That's what he would call it. That's what he dealt with, where someone's got to lose for there to be a winner. And he kind of, his whole life was, I think, going against that.
Well, that's interesting you bring that up, because he clearly says in the book, and I love that book, and that book really I actually use that book a lot throughout my business career, especially that you're negotiating all through your life. And I think that he made that very clear. And it's interesting you mentioned the Soviet thing, and for those listening, Herbie is still with us. He's in Brooklyn tonight, right?
Yeah.
So if I was talking to him right now, I'd probably want to know, okay, you're talking about the Soviet style. So what would he do about Zelensky and Putin?
Well, I'd hate to, every time I think I know, he's 89 and he still says stuff that surprises me, that changes the way I think about things. So I'd hate to say what he would do, but I would think that, he would think that this ultimately has to be negotiated. And both sides has to feel like they're going to get something out of negotiating that they're not going to get right now. It's just such a bad situation. But I'd have to really sort of think about it. But I think that he would think that ultimately there will be a point where they will sit down and they will negotiate. And it's just a question of when that's going to happen and what each side's going to give up. So he did believe, and he does believe that. When he wrote his book, negotiation wasn't really a word used in regular day-to-day life that much, and people were intimidated by it. And I'm still intimidated by it. I hate to go into a car dealership and I hate that.
Oh,
it makes me feel uncomfortable. He thought you should approach it as a game. And he said the key to life is to care, but not that much. And if you look at it like a game, then and play it like a game, you'll have more fun and you'll be more successful. And he thought the thing about negotiation is it's not something you had to learn. It was something you already knew how to do, and you were doing all the time. You just had to recognize you were doing it. And then if you recognize it, you could take control of your behavior and be more effective. So something he said recently that I never really heard him say before was that the best natural negotiators are kids. Because think about when your kid's asking you for like a Hanukkah present or a Christmas present. They set the demands incredibly high. They say they want a car. Well, you're never going to get them a car. But because they said that, they raise the level so high that you end up getting them more than you would just not to disappoint them. And that's just a natural thing, that kids do.
Yeah, they game you.
They game you, and they don't even know that. They know they're doing it in some innate level, but they haven't really taken control of what they're doing, So that was his thing. But I'd like to think about the Zelensky thing.
Yeah. So as a parent, yourself, and growing up with your dad as a parent, were you guys ever is it impossible to game him? Your mom was in the house too, and I wanted to talk a little bit about the whole sweet and low situation in a minute, but what was that like?
Well, he'd always say that the one person you can't negotiate with is your family or your kids. And that's because his key is you got to care, but not that much. You got to be willing to walk away. And when it's your kids, you care too much. So I could negotiate with him. I couldn't negotiate with anybody else, but I could negotiate with him because he loved me, and he cared too much. So I could basically, now, and he'd lose his sense of perspective and everything else. So he wasn't like a superhuman negotiator. He just was, he thinks the key is this. I always thought of it as kind of a Brooklyn Jewish Buddhism. The key was sort of a kind of detachment, and to look at it from the outside and to keep your perspective. And that's the thing he taught me, not negotiating so much, but realizing that none of this really matters that much. That was the game part of it. And when I'd come to him when I was a kid with a problem, the thing he would always say is, it's a blip on the radar screen of life. It's a blip on the radar screen of eternity. It's a walnut in the batter of life. And the idea was that, doesn't really matter. And when you start from that position of it doesn't really matter, you have a lot of freedom and you'll be more effective.
Boy, that is so true. And that's certainly something as a parent, a good lesson to tell your kids at any age when there's disappointments in their life. I think those are really good things. So, got to bring up Sweet and Low. I did not know about this part of your family. So why don't you just kind of give us a little version of that? So Sweet and Low was invented by your father, your grandfather?
I'll just say this. I'll say that my mother's family was from Midwood in Bensonhurst.
Okay.
And her parents were college educated. Her father was a lawyer. They were American born. My grandmother went to college and studied English. And my father's family was, as I said, not educated from Bensonhurst. My father said that they considered their marriage a mixed marriage, an interracial marriage, because they were so different. It was like my mother's family had gotten away from all that immigrant stuff, and my father's family was pulling them back into it. So my grandfather, Ben, his name was Ben Eisenstadt, he went to St. John's Law School, and he came out of law school during the Depression. And he couldn't get any work. Nobody could get work, but a Jewish lawyer was especially hard then. So he ended up getting a job as a counterman in a diner in what is today Cobble Hill. I think it was just Red Hook, Brooklyn. And he ended up falling in love with the waitress, who was the daughter of the owner. The waitress was my grandmother, Betty Gelman. And he took over the diner, and he built the diner up, very ambitious guy, and he moved the diner to the corner of Cumberland Street and Flatbush Avenue, across from the Brooklyn Navy Yard. And the diner boomed, because before World War II, we were rearming. Everybody going off to Europe would be going through that Navy Yard. And when they wanted to go get a meal off base, they'd go to the diner. So based on that boom, my grandfather was able to move his family to Midwood into a house in the American dream. But then everything crashed after the war ended. They were shutting down the Navy Yard. Nobody was there. He was in big trouble. So he thought, what do I know how to do? When he was a kid, he worked at a tea bagging factory owned by one of his uncles, and he knew how to package tea. That's the only thing he knew how to do. So he took his savings and he bought a bunch of tea bagging machines and decided, I will package tea. Okay, this is probably, so he started packaging tea, but nobody wanted that tea. There was plenty of tea. There was no problem with the tea supply. So now he's lost all his money. He's got these machines. He doesn't know what to do. He goes to Cookie's Diner in Brooklyn, sitting with my grandma with his head in his hands, saying, what am I going to do? I'm ruined. What am I going to do? And my grandmother, because she had worked at the diner all those years and had to clean up every night, and was disgusted by the way the sugar congealed in the sugar bowl or got stuck in the sugar dispenser, said, why don't you package sugar? So he went back to the diner, which was now called the packing house, and he reconfigured, very handy person, those machines to package sugar, and he invented the sugar packet. He also invented the soy sauce packet. And he went to Domino Sugar and he pitched his invention. And Domino Sugar, which was right down the water in Brooklyn, asked two questions. One, how does it work? And he showed him. And two, did you get a patent on this? And he hadn't. So they just stole his idea. But he was able to get enough small sugar manufacturers and different people to start packaging sugar and packaging other things like soy sauce, like duck sauce. But he was always on the lookout for his own product to put in his own packages. And he was always on a diet, even though he wasn't heavy. He was always on a diet. Just wanted to look different. And back then they had these cyclamate pills. They're like these tiny little pills that were part cyclamate, part saccharin. and he would crumble them up and put them in his iced tea and put them on his strawberries. And he wanted something real. He wanted something that looked like sugar, but wasn't sugar. So he got together with my uncle, who was studied chemistry at the University of Vermont and a chemist, hired, and they developed all these different versions of fake sugar. It was like the beginning of this. At this point, my father used to come over like a guinea pig and taste all these different cups of coffee sweetened. And finally, they came up with this formula and they packaged it. And my Aunt Barbara drew the logo, and they made it a pink packet because they thought it would stand out among the white packets in the sugar bowl. And at first, he was selling it to hospitals and pharmacies because they thought it would be a medicine, something for diabetics, you know. And what they found out is people started stealing it from the hospitals. And then people started calling the factory and asking to buy it in bulk of it, you know, and it just kind of took off. It became this huge thing. And the last part of the story was there were other competing products, and it had some percentage of that market. But then they determined that cyclamates caused cancer, and they pulled them off the market, and nobody else had an alternative, but he did, because cyclamates were considered dairy. And people couldn't eat them with, Jewish people in Brooklyn couldn't eat them with meat. So he had he had a kosher formula. So he just swapped out the kosher formula for the one with cyclamate, and instantly he was the only one on the shelves. And at that point, Sweet and Low took over like 80% of the market.
Absolutely.
And I always say my family is a family. If you take your basic, average, ordinary, mildly dysfunctional Brooklyn Jewish family and add $100 million a year, you get my family.
Amazing. He obviously
I should
got
say
the patent on that one.
our side was disinherited.
Yeah.
So you don't have to look at me and say, I'm not buying his book. He doesn't need my money.
Yeah. I was going to point out
that
that if you haven't, for those that you'll see that in the book, but no, Rich is not talking to us from a private island of low statues everywhere. So, you know, there's a lot of nostalgia in this book, which clearly I can see for you is a labor of love, and sports is, as we talked about earlier, always been a big part of your life. And I think I heard you say once that you know, your dad and Larry, you know, would go to a lot of baseball games, because I obviously had the experience of doing that with Larry. And if I recall, something happened once where you were at an Orioles game and he was so excited to see one of the players.
Well, I should say that when he was a kid, so this goes back to when they're kids, because he always tells this story. I think I'll get it right, which him and Larry, they were members of the Police Athletic League, which would take kids, you know, to games.
Right.
Pay for them. And they bring him out for a Police Athletic League, which still exists, Police Athletic League clinic on the pitcher's mound. And Larry would always tell this story. I don't know if you ever heard it, where Billy Pierce, I think was the pitcher's name, was showing him how to throw the curveball. And my father said, Billy, you're throwing that curveball wrong. And no one could believe this, like, kid had said this. And he said, well, show me how you threw it. And my father showed me, he goes, actually, the kid's right. I do throw it wrong, you know? So when I was a kid, my dad and Larry's favorite thing to do was to go to these baseball games. And I think what you're talking about is, I'm a huge Cubs fan.
Right. I was going to go there.
My team was the 1984 Chicago Cubs, which a team that released a country music song called Men in Blue that had the chorus, as sure as there's ivy on the center field wall, the men in blue are going to win it all. And by the way, only about 3 people still have that record, mostly because the men in blue did not win it all. They did not even get to the World Series. No. So it was a big collapse. It was heartbreaking. And years later, I went to Camden Yards in Baltimore with Larry and my father. We went out in the field, and I think my father and Larry saw Frank Robinson. And they got so excited that they went over to talk to Frank Robinson. And Rick Sutcliffe, who'd won the Cy Young in 1984 for the Cubs, was at the end of his career, and he was pitching batting practice. And he came over. I think this is the story you mean.
Yeah.
He came over to me and he said, did your dad just ditch you because he saw someone famous that he needed to talk to? I'm like, yeah, basically. And I said, as long as I got you, you know, I'm a big Cubs fan, and I have the Men in Blue 45 because he sings on it. And he was so excited. And we talked about the 45, and he said, give me your address. I said, why? He said, I'm not going to tell you. So I gave him my address, and he put it in the back of his pants. He's wearing like baseball pants. And like 3 weeks later, I got a little box in the mail, and it was a ball signed by all the Cubs. And there was a note that said, Sutcliffe told me to send this to you, Sandberg.
Oh
So
my God,
Ryan Sandberg sent that ball.
That's such a great story. And, how did your dad feel about you being a Cub fan? I mean, growing up, a Dodger fan, and obviously being from New York, the Yankees, which fortunately, as a Met fan, won all the time. But being a Cub fan, I mean, I'm glad your dad lived to see this, and you lived to see it, because at some point after Steve Bartman, you probably thought that would never happen. But that must have been interesting, like being
He
a Cub
told me
fan.
when I was a kid not to be a Cubs fan. He actually said, do not be a Cubs fan. Cubs fans don't have as good of a life, because you accept losing as a natural condition of everything. And you expect everything to end in defeat, and you'll accept less, and you'll have a worse life. So don't be a Cubs fan. So of course I became a Cubs fan. And my father was friendly with Tommy Lasorda. This was another thing that happened. And this is when I was older. We went to a Dodgers game at Wrigley Field, and we were going into the Dodgers clubhouse to see Lasorda. And I was wearing a Cubs hat. And my father told me to take it off, that it was disrespectful to go into the Dodgers clubhouse wearing a Cubs hat. And we got in a huge fight. And I took it off. And we went into Lasorda's little office in Wrigley Field, where, by the way, Lasorda's got this big belly. His pants are open. He's wearing like a muscle shirt, and his desk is covered with every signature dish from every Italian restaurant in Chicago. And he's had like a bite of each one.
Right.
And I've met him before, and he's like, what's wrong with you? You seem like you're at a Cubs game. Like, why are you such a bad mood? And I said, we got in a big fight. And he asked what about, and I told him, and he said, Herbie, I like you. You're a very smart man, but about this, you're dead wrong. Don't you want your kid that supports his team no matter what? What kind of kid do you want? A rat for a kid? So I put on my Cubs hat.
Go Tommy.
And for my bar mitzvah, Lasorda sent me a present. You know what he sent me? He sent me Ron Say's baseball glove.
Wow.
Because Ron Say had gone from the Dodgers to the
Cubs, right?
Third base for the '84 Dodgers. Yeah.
Wow, that's a great story. And I actually met Lasorda with Larry King a number of times, and actually with your dad at a number of events. And really great guy, Tommy Lasorda. So before we grab a few questions here, you talk about asking your dad, and you were talking about life a minute ago, about the meaning of life, which is kind of the question we all talk about. And it's actually something, I think, in one of the last interviews I did with Larry just a few months before we lost him, he talked about that, and he went into the whole Mel Brooks shtick, and we went from there. But that a question your dad, has pondered?
Well, I'll tell you first, because I did an article, a profile of Larry for Rolling Stone when I was in my 20s. And I spent a week with him. I spent as a reporter at La Costa, which is, the Teamsters place, where, by the way, the main activity of every day was nude volleyball, which old men playing nude volleyball, which I was very happy to find out was in the water. Good. Then I found out but every now and then somebody goes up for a spike.
Oh.
So Larry, we talked about this, and Larry was talking about, whether or not, if he was sick, if he was not responsive, did he want to be unplugged? And Larry said, no, keep me plugged in. No matter what you think my condition is, keep me plugged in. And he goes, and if you see any other things in the room that are unplugged, plug those things in too, plug everything in. So when I was working on this book during the quarantine, I wasn't really seeing my father very much because of the quarantine.
Right.
And I was talking to him on the phone, and finally I thought, there's the big question. I never really come flat out and ask it. And I said, what's the meaning of life, basically? And he laughed and he said, don't you know? I said, no. He said, the meaning of life is more life. Keep living. That's basically what he said.
No, that's a beautiful thing. And that's actually not that different from what Larry said to me, because he could never understand. And in our final interview, we talked about this, and he says, I can't imagine not being around, like not being, here and not knowing who won the World Series. And as a tribute to Larry, I always thought it was really fantastic that the last World Series that he got to see, his Dodgers won the World Series.
Well, that was a
That
big
was
thing for
really-
me every World Series. I would watch it when the Dodgers were playing in the playoffs of the World Series, and Larry was always seated
in the pink shirt sometimes.
right by, and you could
Yep.
see him, and you could see him like, oh, Larry's going to get ice cream because
Yeah.
the seat's empty. Oh, Larry's got a yogurt in a cap.
Yep.
You know, and turning it on last year and he wasn't there was depressing.
I feel the same way, and I watched a lot of those games with my mom, who's watching this interview. Who, by the way, I will mention, since she is watching, was the face of J-Date in one of their more recent ads that they did with Yentas finding dates for their kids.
Nice.
And my mom, speaking of Brooklyn, had a poster above Junior's Cheesecake in Brooklyn of something like code all day, fetch all night, it said.
Nice.
So you never know how that grows. So Randy, I'm going to turn it over to you. Do we have some questions?
Hi, Randy.
Yes.
Yeah.
Hello. Such good stories. So a couple of questions. First, how and why did you become a Cubs fan?
Well, so my father, who, was from Brooklyn, when he was in college, he went to the Army, came back, went to college, met my mom at NYU, and then had to work to put himself through law school. And he worked at Allstate Insurance as a claims adjuster. And that was really where he learned to negotiate, because it was on the street negotiating. And he was very successful there, and he became the head of his unit, the head of the department, the head of the region. And then they transferred him to Chicago because Allstate was owned by Sears, and Sears is headquartered in Chicago. So he went out there one weekend not knowing anybody, and he bought a house in Libertyville, Illinois, where we were. So my mom was very freaked out about this move. She couldn't drive. Okay. She learned to drive there. And he said, well, at least, there's Jewish people there in that town. And she said, how do you know that? He said, there's a Chinese restaurant. Turns out Libertyville was like the only town in America with a Chinese restaurant and no Jews. We were the only Jews in Glencoe. And later on, we eventually moved to Glencoe, Illinois, which is a lot of Jews. And my father said, I'd say to him, like, was there a lot of anti-Semitism in Libertyville? And he said, no, they didn't even know what a Jew was. When we moved in, they ran over, they said, thank God, we thought they were going to sell to Catholics. So they haven't even figured out who we were yet. So because I lived there, the Cubs were on TV. And what's great about the Cubs as a kid is they didn't have any night games. So you come home from school, there was a 3:05 start in the summer. It's great. You come home at 3:05 and the Cubs are on TV right when you get home from school. And they had those great announcers. They had Jack Brickhouse and Harry Carey, and they had a lot of fun players and a lot of bad teams. And it was still a lot of fun. And you could go to games. You could take the train down, and it was very cheap as a kid. And you could just go sit in the bleachers and watch those games. So to me, being a Cubs fan is probably like being a Dodgers fan was to people, 30 years earlier. And I do remember my father really liked Wrigley Field because he said it reminded him of Ebbets Field because it was built in the same era. He said the only difference is Ebbets Field was enclosed and Wrigley Field was open. But they remodeled Wrigley Field, and now it's like enclosed. Seems like Ebbets Field in there.
Yeah, that's a nice connection.
Yeah.
Between the two. So did you always know that you would write this book?
Well, I've been writing about my first book was Tough Jews, and the whole beginning is about my dad, Larry, and their friends Sid and Asher hanging out at Nate and Al's in Beverly Hills and talking about Jewish gangsters from Brooklyn. And so my father, I learned how to tell stories, I think, from my father, unless it's just a genetic thing. So he's the font for me of storytelling. So I think that it's just natural to me that I keep going back to these stories. It's like, to me, it's like I had these stories or like our own personal little legends, and I grew up with them and they formed my whole worldview. So I do think I always knew I would write it, and I'll probably write it again.
And that's a great segue to the next question, which how did you whittle down the stories and choose which to include and which not to include?
Well, I try to tell stories that I thought also told the story of my father's life and also expressed his philosophy. So I wanted the book to be a lot of entertaining stories, but I'd like you to also get a little bit of what people got from You Can Negotiate Anything, which are some of his ways of dealing with what is sometimes a cruel and uncaring world, and his way of dealing with authority and sort of feeling like you're in control of your own destiny. So I think that that's the stories I picked. I picked stories that told that story.
Mm-hmm. Great lessons.
So to me, they
can
weren't
all
just
learn.
anecdotes. They were like, they had a point.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's very clear. Sylvia wants to know what happened to Mappo.
Mappo, I don't know where Mappo is now, but I went to college with Mappo's daughter,
Wow.
which we figured out. And there's a story about when my dad and Larry were on the radio together, because my dad used to go and just be on Larry's show, as Mitch I'm sure remembers,
Yeah.
and just kind of bullshit. And he was on Larry's show in Miami. Larry had this big show in Miami, and they told the Mappo story together, and they got a call. Mappo had heard the story and was calling in. And the story is always that they put Mappo on the air. Larry asks a lot of questions about Mappo, what he was doing. And my father says, "Hey, Mappo, hang up, you're dead." And then hung up on him. And that was the last anybody heard from Mappo. Except I met his daughter in college.
That's hysterical. Wow.
So did your father read the book?
Yes.
And what did he think?
He's got his criticisms like he always does, but I think all in all, more positive. He likes it.
Great. So entertaining, really great stories and lots of lessons to learn. Thank you so much for sharing. Mitch, do you have any last questions?
I just wanted to add one other thing that I took away from the book that I thought was, I imagine is a quote from your dad that I just think is so beautiful about power is based on perception. Even if you don't got it, you got it.
Well, the way he said, power is based on perception. If you think you got it, you got it, even if you don't got it. I might mess it up.
Oh.
And if you don't think you got it, even if you got it, you don't got it. And I see that play out all the time. And in his book, one of his examples he used is me. He opened with this story. So if ever he got upset about me about something I wrote in my book, I would say, just remember how you started your book, which is he started when I was 9 years old and I didn't like to go to restaurants. And I stood up on the table in the restaurant and screamed, "This is a crummy restaurant," causing them to take me out of the restaurant and not take me back to a restaurant for like 20 years. So I use, as he would say, information, their fear of shame, to realize I had power to get what I wanted, which is to leave that restaurant. So as the youngest brother and a little kid, seemingly with no power, I exercised power because I believed I had power.
That's a great
That's
line.
great.
That's great.
Thank you for sharing Herbie's adventures with us.
Thank you very much.
The book
Nice talking to
is
you.
awesome.
No,
Have a
thank
good-
you. Yeah,
Thank
thank
you,
you,
Mitch.
Rich. Thank you,
And
Rich.
thank you.
And again, here's the book, and there is I think a link down in the in
There is.
okay, so you can get it. It's great.
All right.
And I'll also be sending out the link tomorrow.
Great. Thank you. Thanks, Randy. Thanks,
Thank
Mitch.
you so much.
Thank
Thank
you.
you to everyone.
Thank
Have a
you.
wonderful
So long.
evening.
Thanks.
Take
Have a great
care.
night. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.